July 25, 1944. Normandy. 5:42 a.m. The bombardment had stopped 20 minutes ago, but Private Jack Morrison could still feel it in his chest, a phantom percussion that made his ribs hum. The air smelled of cordite and burning rubber and something sweet and rotten that he tried not to think about. Around him, the ruins of Caen smoldered in the dawn light, every building reduced to jagged teeth of masonry and twisted steel. The city had been beautiful once. Now it was a graveyard with streets. Morrison crouched behind a shattered wall with 11 other men from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, waiting for the order to advance. They had been told the Germans were retreating. They had been told resistance would be light. They had been told a lot of things that turned out to be lies. A sergeant, Morrison never learned his name, crawled along the line checking weapons, whispering instructions. When he reached Morrison he paused. You see movement, you fire. You don't wait. You don't hesitate. Understood. Morrison nodded. His hands were shaking. He gripped his rifle tighter, hoping the sergeant wouldn't notice. The sergeant moved on. And then, from somewhere ahead, a street, a cellar, a pile of rubble that looked like every other pile of rubble, came the sound of a machine gun opening fire. Sharp. Precise. Disciplined. The wall beside Morrison exploded in a spray of brick dust and he threw himself flat, pressing his face into the dirt that tasted of ash and blood. The firing continued. Not wild. Not panicked. Controlled bursts, each one placed with surgical accuracy. Someone screamed. Morrison couldn't tell who. He lay there, heart hammering, and thought, they're not retreating. They're waiting. What made fighting the Germans so hard for Canadian soldiers in World War II was not a single factor but a constellation of them: tactical, psychological, material, and moral. The Wehrmacht was not an invincible force. It made mistakes. It suffered defeats. It was ultimately crushed by the weight of Allied industrial power and the relentless mathematics of attrition. But man for man, unit for unit, the German army was among the most formidable fighting forces of the 20th century. And for the Canadians who faced them across the killing fields of Normandy, Italy, and the Netherlands, that formidability was measured not in grand strategic terms but in small, brutal increments. The sniper who never missed, the machine gun nest that wouldn't die, the counterattack that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. This is the story of why the fight was so hard. Not from the perspective of generals or historians, but from the men who lived it, the soldiers who learned, through blood and terror and exhaustion, that the enemy they faced was skilled, disciplined, and utterly unwilling to yield ground without extracting the highest possible cost. Morrison had enlisted in Halifax in the autumn of 1942, 19 years old and convinced the war would be over by Christmas. He trained for 8 months at Camp Aldershot, marching drills, rifle practice, gas mask exercises, bayonet charges against straw dummies that didn't shoot back. The instructors were veterans of the First World War, men with hollow eyes and missing fingers who spoke in clipped, brutal sentences about what to expect. Morrison listened. He thought he understood. He understood nothing. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders landed in Normandy on June 7, 1944, D-Day +1, part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division tasked with pushing inland from Juno Beach. The plan was to advance rapidly, exploit the chaos of the initial invasion, and capture the city of Caen within days. The plan collapsed almost immediately. The Germans, elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, fanatical and terrifyingly effective, counterattacked with a ferocity that stunned the Allied command. The Canadians dug in. The Germans dug in. And Normandy became a grinding, month-long bloodbath of attrition. Morrison's first firefight lasted 4 hours and felt like 4 years. His second lasted 10 minutes and killed half his section. By the end of the first week he had stopped counting. Time became elastic, measured not in hours but in the space between one artillery barrage and the next, one advance and the next retreat, one friend alive and the same friend dead. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The Germans fought with a doctrine that emphasized decentralized command, combined arms coordination and aggressive counterattack. Every German soldier, from private to general, was trained to take initiative, to assess the battlefield, identify opportunities and act without waiting for orders. This philosophy, called Auftragstaktik or mission-type tactics, meant that even when German units were cut off, surrounded, or overwhelmed, they continued to fight with coherence and purpose. There was no central point of failure. Every squad, every platoon, every company was a self-contained fighting organism capable of adapting to changing circumstances. For the Canadians, who had trained under a more rigid, top-down command structure inherited from the British Army, this was disorienting. Orders came from above. You followed them. If the situation changed, you waited for new orders. The Germans didn't wait. They reacted. They improvised. They turned defensive positions into offensive springboards with a speed and fluidity that left Allied commanders scrambling to keep up. Morrison experienced this firsthand during the battle for Verrières Ridge in late July. His platoon had been ordered to secure a farmhouse on the southern slope. They advanced under cover of a smoke barrage, reached the farmhouse and found it empty. The Germans had withdrawn. For 10 minutes, Morrison and his comrades allowed themselves to believe they had won. Then the mortars started. Then the machine guns. Then a Panzer IV appeared from behind a hedgerow 200 meters away and began firing high-explosive rounds directly into the farmhouse. The building disintegrated around them. Morrison ran, everyone ran, back toward the Canadian lines, and as he ran he heard the scream of engines and turned to see German infantry advancing behind the tank, moving in coordinated fire teams, covering each other, closing the distance with terrifying efficiency. He made it back. 12 men didn't. The Germans retook the farmhouse within an hour and held it for another week. German infantry tactics were built around the MG-42 machine gun, a weapon so effective it became known as Hitler's buzzsaw, for the sound it made when firing. With a rate of fire exceeding 1,200 rounds per minute, the MG-42 could suppress an entire platoon, shred cover, and dominate a battlefield in a way few other weapons could match. German squads were organized around the machine gun. Everything else, the riflemen, the submachine gunners, existed to protect and support the MG-42 crew. This meant that Canadian infantry, advancing across open ground, were not facing individual soldiers but a coordinated weapons system designed to inflict maximum casualties at maximum range. Suppression was constant. You couldn't move without being pinned down. You couldn't flank without exposing yourself to another machine gun position. And every time you knocked out one MG-42 nest, another seemed to open fire from a position you hadn't known existed. Morrison learned to hate the sound of that gun. It was a physical thing, a pressure in the air that made your body want to fold in on itself. He learned to recognize the difference between suppressive fire, meant to keep you down, and targeted fire, meant to kill you. He learned that the moment between recognizing the difference and reacting to it was the moment most men died. He also learned that the Germans were not supermen. They bled. They made mistakes. They panicked when caught in the open just like anyone else. But they were disciplined. They had better training, better equipment, and better doctrine. And they fought with a professionalism that made every engagement feel like a chess match where the Canadians were always one move behind. One afternoon in early August, Morrison's section captured a German position overlooking a river crossing. Inside the bunker they found 3 dead soldiers, a functioning MG-42 with several belts of ammunition, and a notebook filled with handwritten notes. One of Morrison's comrades, a French-Canadian named LeBlanc who spoke some German, translated. The notes were firing tables, range estimates, wind adjustments, corrections for different types of targets, infantry, vehicles, aircraft. The German gunner had been preparing for every contingency, calculating every variable, turning warfare into a science. LeBlanc stared at the notebook. Then he looked at Morrison and said, "They're not soldiers. They're engineers." Morrison understood what he meant. The Germans approached combat with a methodical precision that felt less like fighting and more like problem-solving. They studied the terrain. They prepared interlocking fields of fire. They rehearsed their withdrawals so that every retreat was a controlled operation, not a rout. They were not braver than the Canadians. Bravery, Morrison had learned, was not a differentiator in modern war, but they were more effective. And effectiveness, in the calculus of infantry combat, was the only thing that mattered. The psychological dimension was equally punishing. German propaganda had spent years portraying the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable force, and while Canadian soldiers knew intellectually that this was exaggeration, experiencing it on the ground was different. The Germans had better tanks. The Panther and Tiger were superior to anything the Allies fielded until late in the war. They had better anti-tank guns. They had better infantry weapons. And they used these advantages with a tactical sophistication that made every engagement feel like a trap. Morrison saw men break under the strain. Not cowards, there were no cowards, only men who had absorbed more horror than the human mind was designed to contain. They would freeze during an advance, unable to move forward or back. They would weep uncontrollably after a firefight. They would stare at nothing, their eyes flat and distant, and when you spoke to them they wouldn't respond. The medics called it shell shock. The officers called it combat fatigue. Morrison didn't have a name for it. He only knew that it could happen to anyone at any time, and that once it happened the man was gone, not dead but no longer functional. Sent to the rear, sometimes returning, sometimes not. Morrison felt it pulling at him. A gravity that wanted to drag him down into numbness, into the safe emptiness where nothing could hurt him because he wouldn't feel anything at all. He fought it by staying busy, cleaning his rifle, writing letters, talking to the new replacements who arrived every few days, wide-eyed and terrified, to fill the gaps left by the dead. One replacement, a kid from Winnipeg named Carter, asked him, "Is it true the Germans don't take prisoners?" Morrison thought about that. He had heard the rumors, stories of Canadian prisoners executed after capture, particularly by the 12th SS. Some of the stories were true. War crimes had been committed. But not by every German. Not even by most. The majority of German soldiers, Morrison had come to believe, were no different from him. Conscripts or volunteers who had been told they were fighting for something noble and had discovered too late that nobility died in the first 5 minutes of combat. Some don't, Morrison said finally. Most do. Don't count on it either way. Carter nodded, unsatisfied but unable to ask the real question, which was, how do I survive this? Morrison didn't have an answer. No one did. You survived or you didn't. Skill helped. Luck helped more. But mostly you just kept moving forward because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant realizing how slim your chances were. By September the Canadians had learned. They adapted. They developed tactics to counter German superiority, using artillery more aggressively, coordinating air support more effectively, leveraging their numerical and material advantages to grind the Germans down through sheer attrition. The fighting became, if not easier, at least more survivable. The Germans were being pushed back, their supply lines stretched, their ranks depleted. But even in retreat they remained dangerous. Morrison's platoon participated in the liberation of several Dutch towns in October, and in every town the pattern was the same. The Germans would withdraw, booby-trap the buildings, and leave snipers behind to slow the advance. Clearing a single block could take hours. Men died stepping on mines, opening doors, rounding corners. The Germans extracted a price for every meter of ground they gave up. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. In early November, Morrison's unit captured a German medical station in a village near Arnhem. Inside were 2 doctors, 3 nurses and 27 wounded soldiers, Germans and Canadians both, lying side by side on stretchers receiving the same care. The German doctors surrendered without resistance. One of them, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that trembled from exhaustion, spoke English. "We have morphine," he said. "But not enough. If you have supplies, please." Morrison's lieutenant authorized the distribution of Canadian medical supplies to the German wounded. Some of the men grumbled, these were the enemy after all, but no one refused. Morrison helped carry boxes of bandages and plasma into the station, and as he worked he found himself thinking about the machine gun notebook, the firing tables, the meticulous preparation. The Germans were good at war. Terrifyingly good. But here, in this makeshift hospital, they were just doctors trying to save lives with inadequate resources. It didn't absolve them. It didn't erase the brutality, the war crimes, the ideology that had started this nightmare. But it complicated the picture. Made it harder to see them as monsters. Easier to see them as men. Morrison survived the war. He returned to Halifax in May 1945, 22 years old and feeling 60. He tried to explain to his family what it had been like, but the words didn't fit. How do you describe the sound of an MG-42? How do you convey the exhaustion of fighting an enemy who never stopped adapting, who turned every defensive position into a fortress and every retreat into an ambush? He couldn't. So he stopped trying. Years later, in the 1960s, Morrison attended a reunion of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. Old men now, gray-haired and thick around the middle, they sat in a Legion Hall and drank beer and told stories. Someone asked, what made the Germans so hard to fight? The room went quiet. Everyone had an answer. No one wanted to say it aloud. Finally, Leblanc, the French-Canadian who had translated the notebook, spoke. They were professionals. We were citizens. They'd been preparing for war since 1933. We'd been preparing since 1939. They had doctrine. We had courage. Courage wins eventually. But it costs. Someone else added, they weren't supermen. But they acted like they were. And if you believe you're unbeatable, sometimes the other guy starts to believe it too. Morrison nodded. That was part of it. But only part. The real answer was more complex, more uncomfortable. The Germans had built an army designed for aggressive, mobile warfare. They had trained their soldiers to think, to adapt, to fight independently. They had equipped them with weapons that maximized lethality. and they had imbued them with a sense of purpose, however twisted, however evil, that made them willing to die rather than surrender. The Canadians had courage. They had resolve. They had the industrial might of North America behind them. But in those first months, they were outmatched tactically, outgunned materially, and outclassed experientially. They learned. They adapted. They won. But the cost was measured in names carved on cenotaphs in towns across Canada, in men who came home and never spoke of what they'd seen, in the knowledge that victory was not inevitable and that the enemy they had faced was among the most formidable in history. By the end of the war, over 42,000 Canadians had died in the fight against Germany. Thousands more were wounded, physically or psychologically, in ways that never fully healed. They fought in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in the Netherlands. They faced an enemy that was disciplined, skilled, and fanatically committed. They won not because they were better soldiers, though they became very good soldiers, but because they refused to quit, and because the resources of the Allied coalition eventually overwhelmed the Wehrmacht's tactical brilliance. Morrison lived into his 80s. He never forgot the sound of the MG-42. He never forgot the farmhouse at Verriers Ridge or the notebook with the firing tables, or the German doctor asking for morphine. He carried those memories like stones in his pockets, weights that never got lighter but which he learned to bear. When his grandchildren asked him about the war, he told them, "We fought men who were very good at killing. We had to become good at it too. But we never forgot that the point wasn't to be good at killing. It was to stop them." It was the closest he ever came to explaining. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the battles that define us aren't always fought with bullets, and the victories that last aren't always written in history books. The question, what made fighting the Germans so hard, does not have a simple answer. It was their training, their equipment, their doctrine, their experience, their willingness to die for a cause that history would judge monstrous. It was the MG-42 and the Panther tank and the 88mm gun. It was Auftragstaktik and combined arms coordination and defensive tactics honed over centuries of European warfare. It was all of these things, and none of them fully captures the reality. Morrison in his final years would say, "They made it hard because they were professionals fighting for their lives. We made it harder by refusing to accept that being outmatched meant being beaten. In the end we ground them down. But they made us earn it." The ruins of can still stand, rebuilt now, a city resurrected from rubble. Tourists walk the streets and take photographs and visit museums dedicated to the liberation. Few of them know what it cost. Few of them understand that every street was contested, every building fortified, every meter of ground paid for in blood. Morrison would have wanted them to know. Not to glorify war, he hated war with a purity that only those who have fought it can understand, but to remember that victory was not inevitable, that the enemy was formidable, and that the men who faced that enemy and prevailed did so at a cost that should never be forgotten. The war had taught them fear. Victory taught them the price of courage. And the space between, the grinding, brutal months of combat against an enemy who refused to break, taught them that strength is not measured by who wins, but by who endures. They braced for battle. They found a war that would not end. And in that endless struggle, they learned what it meant to face an enemy who was skilled, disciplined, and utterly committed, and to prevail not through superiority but through refusal to yield. The machine gun fell silent. Eventually. But the sound never left.